College football nerds here talking Tennessee and Alabama. I got Josh here getting nerdy with me. And Josh, I'm going to jump straight into this because we do a live show every Saturday. And in that live show, we do a top 10. And 2 weeks ago, not the most recent one, but 2 weeks ago, I put Tennessee at number 4. I got so much hate for that, Josh. Kept them at number 4 this week. And the thing that I said was, there's a lot of unclear, parity between like 4 and 20, and it's hard to know who's who. But in that mess of top 10 that we don't know what to do with, there's one team that's got an elite unit, either offensively or defensively, and that's Tennessee. No other team in the top 10 has an elite offense, in my opinion, or an elite defense beyond the top 3, which means to me Tennessee has the highest ceiling. I think we've seen that ceiling now against LSU and against Florida. But get into that a little bit, just talking about this Tennessee offense matched up against what's probably the best defense in the country. I wouldn't say Tennessee's the best offense. I think that goes to Ohio State, but they're certainly up there. Talk about that matchup first.
It's kind of interesting when you start to look at this matchup and trying to figure out what exactly Tennessee is as a football team. And I'll start by saying, you talk about them having the only elite unit. Now, there's a lot of Clemson and Michigan fans that are currently throwing things at their computer screen. Probably some Penn State fans too.
Throw them.
If nothing else, then for their defenses. But I get at least where you're coming from. And in particular, I'll say Tennessee's offense is a more balanced, capable attack than any other team in the country that is outside those top 3. It's sort of the big caveat, right? One of the things that's really difficult for us when we start to do analytics and modeling and all this other stuff is trying to figure out how to take apart these teams when you don't always have data on the edges. And what I mean by that is anytime you want to evaluate a football team, you need to know where their break point is, where their freeze point is. We've started talking about this several years ago. I know Josh Pates kind of picked up on it and started using his own names. But college football teams generally have a point at which the offense doesn't work and a point at which the offense goes rampant and does whatever they want to do. Ohio State has been past that point all year. Tennessee is probably the one other team that has been past that point all season, where they've generally put up a ton of points in every game, and it doesn't seem to really matter how much you're doing. They're just going to keep scoring. And it really has a lot to do with the amount of explosiveness you bring into the game, the amount of yards per play you bring in, etc. Tennessee's been at that threshold. The problem is when you start to evaluate Tennessee in regard to who they've played and how they've played them and circumstances and whether those teams are really in a position to limit their offense enough that Tennessee has to play football operating in the 6-yard, 5-yard per play range, if that's even a feasible thing. The lowest number Tennessee hit on the season was 5.4 yards per play against Pittsburgh. That was a 34-27 game. Now, technically there were 6.5 yards per play last week against LSU, just like the Ball State game, which was more around 7 yards per play. That's a deceptive number. Tennessee wasn't really trying to score every drive, every play in the game. There's a lot of things that went wrong in that game for LSU, which we'll probably talk about later. So, unless you think Alabama's defense is not any better than Pittsburgh, which I kind of doubt, you don't really know what Tennessee looks like when they face a team that might hold them to something normal. And what does their offense look like when it's held to more like 4.5, 5 yards per play? Does it have the same explosiveness? Those are the questions that we've got to figure out in this preview. We're not going to figure them out in the preview, but we're going to try to show you some models that talk about it a little bit, a couple different angles to look at it, and then conversationally sort of talk about where we're coming from.
Yeah, and Alabama defensively, I mean, people might look at, I heard some people saying, well, Alabama gave up 20 points to Texas A&M and App State only gave them 17. Look, the ridiculous takes coming out of this weekend are pretty ridiculous regarding Alabama. Their defense is, from what I've seen, the best defense in the country, the most explosive defense in the country. They gave up 20 points against a team that was going for it almost every fourth down when they could. They were in kind of Hail Mary mode for 2/3 of the game, and they inherited 4 turnovers and 2 missed field goals. It's insane to me to think that a team gave up 20 points, and they weren't playing Iowa, 20 points in that situation, and that was a bad defensive performance. It was an elite defensive performance. And especially if you look at Haynes King's numbers, he threw for 253, but it was on 46 attempts, 5.4 yards per. They ran for like 2.8 yards per carry. Their production was nothing. They got a couple short fields and scored some points. But on the flip side, Alabama, and what we're going to see in the model and what we're going to see in some, maybe in some predictions, is Alabama's efficiency numbers are really hurt by the fact that they got a lot of yards, especially on the ground last week, and didn't convert those to points. So a lot of models think right now that Alabama's got a scoring efficiency problem. But based on everything we heard in this game, Josh, in terms of like Bryce Young maybe warming up in the tunnel, Bryce Young begging to go in on the last drive, he's probably going to be ready this week. And if we're looking at it, I think we should maybe couch this discussion in a way for the rest of this preview in the consideration that he will be there. If that's the case, what does it do to your perception of Alabama in terms of, one, their offensive production, and two, having a defense that maybe has enough depth that even if they see a lot of plays, might be able to hold up to this Tennessee offense?
It's a difficult thing to try to parse out. So yeah, I mean, when you talk about the Texas A&M performance, start with the defensive side of the ball, which is the more positive one for Alabama. First, they had to face more plays than anyone's had to face against Texas A&M. They faced 72 offensive snaps. That's most in the year. The second closest was Mississippi State, who played 70 offensive snaps, or I should say Texas A&M played 70 against Mississippi State. And the difference, though, is that Alabama held them to over a yard per play less than Mississippi State did. Held them to less yard per play than Texas A&M did, even against the Appalachian State game when Haynes King was just an absolute crater of himself and their offense couldn't get anything going. As you said, there's a lot of factors. That Appalachian State game, when they lost that game 14-17, Texas A&M ran 38 plays in that game, about half as many as they got in the Alabama game. That was the effect of the turnovers, the missed field goals, the way the game was going. They got so many more opportunities. And it's easy, how do you fault a team that allows 20 points when at the same ratio in Appalachian State, they probably would have scored about 28, 30 points in that game if they played the same number of snaps. So obviously the possession count was a huge deal. That gets into the negative, right? And that has to do with where Alabama's offense is at, where Bryce Young is at. The first thing I'll say is my assumption, like you, is that Bryce Young will play. If Bryce Young doesn't play in this game, you can sort of throw everything out, because I don't know how effective Alabama's offense would be without Jalen Milroe. And I'll probably just go ahead and say, if Bryce Young can't go on Saturday, I'm going to pick Tennessee in this game, because I don't have a lot of confidence that Alabama's offense is going to be able to move the ball at all. And it will totally depend on whether or not they get a different quarterback. Jalen Milroe had the yips. You see a lot of young quarterbacks in their first start sort of get big eyes. They don't step into their throws. They use their arm. And when I went back and looked at it, there were a lot of really routine plays that weren't major plays you see in a highlight reel where he just missed. Throws to a tight end or something like that would be a third down conversion, or really a conversion on second down, that kind of thing, where they're not completing these first and second down plays that put them in bad third down situations. And there were routine plays, open guys on crossers they just weren't seeing, weren't throwing to. And I think having Bryce Young, even with a banged up shoulder, which I'm going to go ahead and guess he's going to be something like 85%, is going to be a night and day difference, because I think they can complete those routine plays and they're going to be a much more effective offense than they were.
Can I give you a devil's advocate question, though? Let's say, like, and I don't like doing transitive things or anything like that, but like Anthony Richardson has, I think, one, I didn't look at his final stat line from the Missouri game, but has one career over 200 yard or better passing game in his career. And I think, unless he did against Missouri, and it was against Tennessee, and he threw for 453. You say you wouldn't pick Alabama, and I probably wouldn't either, but let's give a little thought to the fact that, like, Jalen Milroe and Anthony Richardson seem to be about the same quarterback, but Alabama's got a much better run game, a much better defense. So if there's any question on, Tennessee's team right now, it is that defense, especially with the news of today that they're going to be missing probably a star player. I think that A&M is maybe a little more poised to stop Alabama's, Milroe attack than maybe Tennessee is. especially when we saw what we saw from Anthony Richardson. So maybe reframe this a little bit and talk about why you think that Alabama couldn't do the same thing that Florida did, but maybe a little bit better.
Well, I mean, on the question, we talking about Bryce Young or Milroe at quarterback, right?
You said Milroe, you wouldn't pick Alabama to beat him with Milroe, and I'm saying, well, what if they're just Florida with a better defense?
It's a fair question, right? Is Milroe actually worse than Anthony Richardson? Because right now Anthony Richardson's quite bad, and he did have. Look, Richardson has had really 4 games this season where he was in any way competent throwing the football. Really, only 3. One was Tennessee, one was Utah, which he only threw 24 passes, only threw for 168 yards. The other was Eastern Washington. But he was 10.1 yards per against Tennessee. That is 3 yards per attempt higher than any other FBS team they've played, not just P5. I think it says a lot about where Tennessee's defense is. There were a couple mitigating factors in the Texas A&M game. It bothered me that announcers didn't talk about. One was that, I'm drawing a blank now. McKinley Jackson, right? Yep, the interior defensive lineman probably was set to be maybe the top interior defensive lineman in the SEC along with Jalen Carter at Georgia. Actually came back for the Alabama game. I don't know why the announcers didn't mention that because he's been out hurt for a while and their problem's been stopping the interior run. His absence is really what caused him to collapse. They also got Jason Jones back in the secondary, which meant that their secondary suddenly can shift over and get a lot more experienced and a lot better and a lot more sound, and they weren't giving up the same plays they were early in the year. I do agree with you. I think defensively it's a sharp difference. The problem is the way Alabama was executing, I don't know that they're going to move the ball against anybody. I say this a lot, right? There are things at the quarterback position that you do that can scale well, and there are things that are consistent. Stetson Bennett is an extremely consistent quarterback. I think he will typically move the ball well against anyone that gives him open opportunities. It doesn't matter how good or bad you are. If you leave guys open, he's a 6-year player and he knows where they are and he finds them and he completes passes. If you are in lockdown coverage downfield, he doesn't necessarily make a lot of hero throws. What Alabama was doing bad was they weren't completing the most readily open things. If they had a guy wide open, they wouldn't see it, they wouldn't complete the pass. It may be that Milroe can make a hero throw, but I kind of doubt it. My concern is that it doesn't really matter how bad Tennessee is. I don't think Milroe's at the same place Anthony Richardson is in terms of a quarterback that can just see an open guy and throw it and hit it. There's a lot of confidence there with Richardson that Milroe doesn't have. And given the fact that Tennessee, this is the important part, right? Tennessee's offense is so much better than Texas A&M, they're going to score points. And so Alabama does actually have to keep pace in this game in a way they never really had to against Texas A&M, right? They got a lead, and they just kind of held the lead and hung on for dear life. I think it's a very different ball game. I feel like I'm giving a lot of monologues right now, just sort of talking in hypotheticals. And we can continue to talk about it, but I think it also could be helpful to actually dig in the model a little bit and just get all that out of the way, and then maybe we can have more of a conversation about it.
Yeah, one thing I'll also add before we get into the model, maybe kind of a devil's advocate to my own devil's advocacy, is if we're looking at the Florida game itself, yes, Anthony Richardson had 453 yards. He threw for 10-point-something yards per attempt. But a lot of people, and I get in a lot of arguments on Twitter where people are like bashing Tennessee, and they're like, you barely beat a bad Florida team. First of all, it was a major rivalry. It was a big deal to beat them at home. But that game, 38-33, is not what that game was. That game was a 17-point game. Florida had to drive the field twice against Prevent, and they did. To their credit, they did. But that was still a game that was a 17-point game with 5 minutes left to go in the game. And Tennessee wasn't going to lose that game unless some ridiculous things happened. So they did get into a little bit of Prevent mode. So I think it's a little unfair to say that's a 5-point game. You're only 5 points better than Florida. I think the one that I would point to if I'm thinking about maybe Tennessee might not be as good as their record would be the Pitt game. But even then, that's the second game of the season and it's on the road. So you could say the same thing for Alabama. But yeah, let's get into the model and see what it has to say.
So the model this week is going to be a little interesting because we'll start with our standard model and then we may couch it and sort of give a different description because there's some strange things going on. The interesting thing in the model is you've sort of got the tail of the score and the tail of the yardage. The Alabama defensively is elite. 55% of opponent rushing averages, 72% of opponent passing averages. Tennessee's numbers are surprisingly good. right now in the model. 68% of opponent rushing averages and 100% of opponent passing averages. That's a good run defense. It's a perfectly mediocre pass defense. I shouldn't really say good, but that's still actually the sign of a decent, okay defense, which I don't think has really been the reputation. Given where Alabama's at and Tennessee's at offensively, it's important to remember Tennessee's passing game is better than Alabama's right now statistically. Alabama's run game is actually more better than Tennessee's passing game is versus Alabama, if that makes sense. Alabama's run game is about 2.3 yards per carry better. Tennessee's passing game is about 2.7 yards per attempt better, but from a percentage perspective, Alabama has a bigger edge there. And what that means is that Alabama actually gets a yard per play advantage in the model. They're expected to have about 6.4 yards per play compared to about 4.8 yards per play for Tennessee. The confusing or confounding part, I think, to a lot of people is despite over a yard and a half per play advantage, the model favors Tennessee, and it favors them by 8, 36-28. So the model is actually predicting a situation in which Alabama outgains Tennessee, doesn't just outgain them, but outgains them by roughly 25%. So a significant number, something you're probably looking at like a maybe 400 yard, maybe 375 to 400 yards from Tennessee, 500 yards from Alabama, that kind of a result. But the score is actually 8 points in Tennessee's favor. First, let's unpack that, Daniel, before we get to the next part of the model, because I think this helps sort of set the stage, right? I know we talked about this a little bit before because I warned you. The reality here is that Alabama's yard per play number is not being translated into points, and it is due to the fact that they've had a couple games now, the Texas game, the Texas A&M game in particular, where they've had turnovers, where they've had a lot of stalled drives, they've had some missed field goals, and the model does not have much confidence in Alabama's ability to score points. Conversely, Tennessee has not been held to anything less than 34 points in a ball game. And we talk about this a lot. When a team is constantly scoring mid-30s or above, our model starts to think, look, you're going to get your points no matter what. Elite offenses always tend to score. That's been our mantra for the past few years. So the question is, how much do you trust that? How much do you think the Texas A&M result has anything to do with Alabama's offensive production going forward? Do you buy that Tennessee's offense is in that sort of elite tier where they can score 35 points or more? And do you believe that elite tier even exists anymore in 2022 when it seems like defenses are starting to catch up? So now that I've talked for, I feel like an hour, Daniel, I'm going to shut up for a minute. I'm going to let you comment on it and maybe give your thoughts on the model and your thoughts about trying to place Tennessee within this context.
Yeah, I do think that maybe not quite as bad as it was during COVID, maybe just before COVID year, and then 2020 and 2021, where offenses were going to score. They were scoring, elite offenses were going to score 35 plus, even on elite defenses. I think defenses are better. But on the flip side, I don't think it's all the way there. I think Tennessee is going to score on anybody. I don't know that they're going to hit 38 to 40, but they're going to score on almost anybody. I have a couple of concerns if I'm an Alabama fan. One is Bryce Young, 100%. Two, is he going to play at all? Like, this could be a lot of smoke and mirrors, and Milroe comes out there anyway, and it's on the road. And, one of the things for me is I'm kind of willing to forgive the Texas, score and situation because it was on the road. It was 120 degrees on the field. Texas had prepared for 6 months for this game. They had inside knowledge of the program. And then a lot went wrong in that regard in terms of them. They just weren't set up to do well in that game. But I think the same thing with Tennessee and Pitt. If they played again today, even if Slovis played the whole game, I think Tennessee beats them by 3 touchdowns. So it's hard for me to judge much from those early games. And then if you think about the rest of Alabama's slate with Bryce Young in the game, it's been Utah State, UL Monroe, Vandy, first quarter against Arkansas. Like, it's so hard to know if Alabama is that elite team, because if they are, if Alabama is who we saw against Vanderbilt in first quarter of Arkansas with Bryce Young in the game, if that's who they are now, they beat Tennessee. But I'm not sure that it is. I want to see them be that team. And then are they that team with Bryce Young, at 85%? I don't know that they are. I'm going to give a score on this. I think that Bryce Young's going to play. And I think that he's going to be healthy enough for Alabama to put up some points. I think that Alabama's defense might shock Tennessee a little bit. But even with Bryce Young in the game, I'm not picking Alabama to cover, which means it's anybody's game. 34-31 Alabama. And Josh, I'll say this before I turn it over to you. Alabama absolutely needed to win that game last week because it gives them breathing room to lose this week. They can lose this week, and this might mean that they're relaxed and chill and score a bunch of points and win big. They can lose this week because they're still going to win the West. They're going to win the West. The West isn't great this year. And so as long as they win the SEC championship, they're going to the playoffs, which means they've got a loss in the bag. And that's why they couldn't afford to lose last week. Because you lose two weeks in a row, it's tough to make the playoffs. We haven't seen a two-loss champion yet make the playoffs. So if that's present in Alabama's mind, I think it could take some of that pressure off of them. But I will say the same thing exists for Tennessee. They can lose this game and still easily make the playoffs. It just means that whomever loses this game no longer has the luxury of maybe being able to lose in the SEC championship game and still go to the playoffs. That's all I'll say. I think that's an opportunity for Alabama to be a little more relaxed in this game. But I want to see them put it all together on the road before I think they're going to cover 7.5 against Tennessee. And I wouldn't be surprised if Tennessee won this one.
I think that's all fair. The difficult thing really comes down to trying to gauge where Tennessee's at defensively, where Alabama's at offensively. I think you know what Tennessee's offense versus Alabama's defense looks like. You know, it's possible to score on Alabama's defense. I think it's extremely hard. I think it's as hard as it was to score on Georgia last year. I think Tennessee is better offensively. I think Alabama, I don't know if they're quite as good as Georgia was last year defensively, but in terms of pass defense, they might be as good or better. We've talked about a lot where those statistics are at. You know, 70% of opponent passing average is an elite number. 55% of opponent rushing averages is an elite number. It's hard to score. So I think in reality, this number of 36 that's by Tennessee is unrealistic. One thing I decided to do was to go back and try to adjust for these sort of weird happenstance things that have happened in the last week and the weirdness that was in the model. So I went back and I looked at a data from a week ago. I said, okay, let's throw out the LSU game for Tennessee. Because remember, LSU went into that game having lost their left tackle that morning and their left guard in the first quarter. And that caused LSU's run game to completely crater. They were held to under 2 yards a carry, and that was a run-first team. I don't know that that's really an accurate depiction of what Tennessee is as a football team, and I think that really skews their numbers. And on the other hand, Alabama, look, they're not going to be the same offense that they were last week with Jalen Milroe. They're just not. Even if you think Bryce Young is, 85% of what he was before, again, they're going to make those routine plays. They're going to have some semblance of a passing game. They're just going to be a different offense. And so I did that first off. And then my next question was, okay, but let's also assume that, let's just say for the sake of argument, Tennessee played this 85 Chicago Bears. They held them to 2 yards per play. They got 3 points out of the game. So I gave them this basically low yardage baseline. And I should say I didn't affect any of the production stats for Tennessee. I only did this for training the model about how to evaluate scores. Basically, how do you take production and turn it into a score? That part of it, I basically gave it an anchor and held it to the bottom and said, this is what happens when they don't get any yardage. And the fascinating thing there is it changes the score pretty dramatically. Between those two things, it makes it Alabama 34, Tennessee 18. And I think that says a lot about how big the picture difference was from last week to this week. Alabama's viewed as 7 to 10 points worse. Tennessee's viewed as something like 10 points better than they were, maybe 20 points better than they were. And when I went back and did that exercise, it did convince me, along with, I'll say, from explosiveness metrics, if you start looking at EPA-based metrics, Tennessee has an explosiveness rating on offense of 1.24, and it's 1.69 in the passing game. Their explosiveness defensive rating, allowed, 1.35, actually higher than their offensive rating. Their passing rating allowed is almost exactly the same, 1.65 versus 1.69. In other words, Tennessee's defense is as apt to give up an explosive play as they are to create one. And taken all together with how good I think Alabama's passing game is, I actually think Alabama might probably cover in this game. I think it's tough. I think Tennessee's going to score some points, certainly. But I'm going to go with Alabama 34, Tennessee 24. My confidence level is minimal, as it has to be with a banged-up quarterback. But when I really dug into it and I started trying to filter for all the noise and junk in these data sets, really just taking out the last week and the results of an LSU team that I think was absolutely crippled, and a Texas A&M team that was playing above their heads with healthy players against a backup quarterback, suddenly this starts to look a lot more like you thought it was going to look like. And I think we're probably overreacting a lot to last week's game. Again, basically of the 14 possessions that Alabama played, 6 were left empty due to circumstance, missed field goal or turnover. That's not really a realistic thing to be repeated on top of their normal offensive performance. So, yeah, I think Alabama wins, and I think Alabama probably covers. And I think it's really going to come down to Alabama's defense more than their offense, but I think Tennessee still, their defense is shaky enough. They're going to let Alabama operate as long as they have competent quarterback play, and I just don't think they can keep pace.
Interestingly enough, we're both picking Alabama to not cover because the line opened at 7 and has already moved to 7.5. I will say this. We're making a lot of assumptions here. One,
I have Alabama by 10, so.
Oh, well, then there you go. I didn't write it down. I wasn't paying attention. We're making a lot of assumptions here. One being that Bryce Young's going to play and be healthy enough to not be affected. Like, he's still going to, if that deep ball's open, he's going to be able to exploit it. They're not going to be able to run single safety all day and really stop the run. We're assuming that mid 60s percentage against opponents allowed is a little bit of a false number for Tennessee. And we are assuming that Alabama's road woes are a thing of the past. So Tennessee fans are going to say in the comments, man, y'all are giving a lot of benefit of the doubt to Alabama. And you're right, we are. And maybe it's just because of the history, not of this series, but just of the history of Alabama in general. Any one of those three things rears its ugly head for Alabama, Tennessee probably wins this game. I'm just assuming that those things are sorted out. It's a road game in a crazy atmosphere. I pump up Beaver Stadium a lot and say that's a great place to watch a football game. Tennessee's going to be as loud as Beaver Stadium, as the Shoe, as LSU would have been maybe last week if it was a night game. So Bama better be ready to not be doing long checks to the line, things like that. All right, let us know in the comments what you think the score is going to be. Make sure, Tennessee fans, because we haven't been on you too much in the past, we're here now, we're talking about you. Make sure if you haven't yet, like, subscribe, notification bell, but also, before you go, in the comments, tell us that score, tell us how bad you're going to beat Bama, and we'll mix it up with you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.